Hello and welcome to the Froggy Five. I'm your host, Jim Freilich, founder and managing partner of Froggy Companies. And today we have a special treat for you here. I've got Jerry Chu on the line, who is CEO and founder of Lofty AI. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, within all these properties you guys have developed, you're continuing to evolve. And I think some segment of properties now that you do, the owner's still managing for the most part, or so maybe there's a subset of properties. I'm not maybe remembering my discussions in the past with Max, right?
Yeah.
But maybe you can clarify, how is it different? And then sort of wrapped up in that is like, we know how to underwrite properties well. We do it a lot. If I'm investing in a bunch of your properties, well, now I got to magnify how many times I'm doing due diligence. I'm going to make sure I do it right. If the onus is upon me to do that, what is the first underwriting on your side of the equation before it makes it onto the platform? What are the gates to get through? Like if I bring you a property tomorrow, Jerry, I got these 10 properties, I want to tokenize them. Boom. You guys, other than background checks, making sure I'm not a criminal, the normal due diligence, what are the gates, I guess?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And again, there, are no gates, and that might sound scary to some people, but what we do instead is just make everything so transparent that, anything kind of unconventional can be sniffed out very quickly.
Gotcha.
And so what happens is obviously there's a background check on the seller. So we check your credit, we check your background. Like there have been people denied listing on Lofty because we found that they had mortgage fraud in their criminal records and things like that. So that's number one. You have to be free and clear as an individual. And then the second thing is every property has to come with an appraisal and inspection report. So we order that, but the sellers actually pay for it. And so, you're going to get your property appraised and you're going to get a professional inspector in there. And so there's not a whole lot you could hide. Like if there's issues with the roof, like it will be stated in that report. And, based on comps and, we don't always agree. Not everyone agrees with the appraiser, right? There's no sort of perfect system to value real estate properties, single family specifically. But I think it's sort of an industry standard thing where, mortgage providers and banks and individuals sort of universally say, okay, well, this is the appraised value. Like it's kind of the standard.
Sure.
So
Which is good, as good as you can get with appraisers, right? The
exactly.
world of appraising is
And
its
these
own
are just
thing.
like normal appraisers, traditional appraisers. There's nothing fancy or weird going on here. So all of that information, along with any rent rolls, if you have a lease, if there's a tenant currently leasing the property, you're going to have to provide that lease. You're going to have to provide rent rolls. We're going to check, like, you have to send bank details over to be like, oh, are you actually receiving that rent? So all of those things are verified. And then guess what? All of that information becomes publicly available. You don't even have to have a Lofty account. Anyone looking at any of these properties can click into the documents tab and view every single piece of information I just mentioned and more. There's actually, in fact, more details in there. So if there's been any rehab work done, any maintenance work done, the invoices are in there. The receipts are in there. Yeah. And so, it's an extremely transparent process. And as a result of that, we don't really prevent any specific properties from coming on the platform, because if there's anything the seller's trying to hide, there's not a whole lot that can get through the system. Like that would be available if they're like, hey, there's foundation issues, I'm going to try to hide that. Like that's pretty difficult. Like usually the inspector finds that. And same thing if they want to charge egregious fees, that's all publicly released as well. So a lot of our users are actual professional real estate investors who own, like 10 units. Some of them own like 40 units or 100 units on the side outside of the platform. And so these people know exactly what to look for, and they dig through all of this information. And we actually have a Discord server where all the Lofty owners who are verified and own at least one token in any property can join and basically discuss all these deals together and ask questions and chat with other fellow Lofty users. And so all of these get surfaced in these channels immediately. Someone will pull up and it's like, oh, this is like non-standard. I don't think this is a good deal for these reasons, right? And so the sort of community is underwriting its own deal. And we as a platform just ensure that, hey, you as the community, you as the individual user have all the possible information you could ever need to underwrite these deals yourself. So that's really the process.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that's really smart. in the big picture of what's going on with this in terms of tokenizing single family rentals, especially. I know you do more than single family to a degree, but the bulk of what you have, I think, are single family rentals, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
That are in there. And that's really great because it's like for this era, for the tokenization era, for the fractionalization era, for the era of open source information and the way social media works, you're going to probably uncover a lot more quicker. And I've been amazed going on, and I look at these different properties, I looked at several, and I'm like, it's just all there. You do have to do your due diligence,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like you're getting more data. Now people realize. I'll give you an example of how this is now. For someone your age, it's like probably a no-brainer. But I'm probably talking. I mean, this is for some older people like me, 50s and above. It wasn't until like about 20 years ago that people realized, every camera is a sensor. You know what I mean? Every camera,
Mm-hmm.
something happens, everything's going on at once. So 20 years ago, there was, I did a lot of stuff with Homeland Security. I had a history as a systems engineer, and I
Mm-hmm.
worked for the military. I worked for Homeland Security, counterterrorism, things like that. Where there was, in one case, we were doing public health support when there was a tsunami and it was overseas, and Sri
Mm-hmm.
Lanka was affected by it, and there were public health people going over, and I was doing a report where we had to gather data and find out what's going on, or say Hurricane Katrina and what's going on in this area. And there's like the public information, right? At some point around then, 2004, there's like what's happening publicly and what's official and what all these different agencies
Mm-hmm.
and government things can put
Yeah.
together. And then there's like people on the ground running around with cameras and stuff. And there was a time when suddenly, even though it was harder to verify all that, I was getting way more quality information from just people running around on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And so I draw an analogy to this of like, we can go through our formal due diligence, say one property at a time. Like if I were using your AI tool and it's just me, I got to do all that myself. But now when you bring in all these people with different backgrounds and skepticism, some are negative Nancy, some are like super optimistic. Now they suddenly have all this depth and breadth of data that will quickly uncover that. And that's a real free market type of thing anyway. That is like what you're trying to do with the NASDAQ idea, right? Like,
Exactly, exactly. And the
okay.
idea is kind of people keep what people like about real estate investing and then just get rid of what they don't like about real estate investing.
Mm,
So if you look at our platform, that's how we've intentionally built everything. People like deciding which properties to invest in. They like doing their own due diligence. They want to know, like they have this belief that, hey, I know more information in a certain neighborhood, maybe because I live in the city, right?
yeah.
And I actually am bullish on the city because of X, Y, Z and reasons. And in many cases, they can actually beat the market. They can beat a REIT. They can beat the national average for price appreciation and things like that because real estate is so local. So these local people actually have a huge edge over institutional investors in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what people like to do. And we just make that process easier. What they don't like to do is hunt for the materials and to call up the seller and have to call up the agents to get the data and the information. But once you provide all of it, people love actually going through it and doing their own research. And then on top of that, the idea is you can't really specialize in more than one thing in life, right? So typically, someone is an expert at underwriting and doing the data stuff. But then we also have users who are actual contractors and like they paint walls. There might be a painter in your DAO. And so when they look at the photos, we have people point out, it's like, hey, I do like X and Y, Z in work. Like this is shoddy work. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
look in that picture. Like that is not high quality work. That's a piece of information that even seasoned real estate investors, if you don't go to the property to physically look at the wall yourself, you're looking at pictures, might not pick up on. But because someone else who has that expertise is in the same ownership group as you, they can actually surface that information. And then all we do as a business is just making sure that the technology is here so that all of this is available to you and that real estate transactions, which is the biggest headache piece for most people, is
Mm-hmm.
seamless and instantaneous. And then everyone's happy. All the stuff they hate is gone, and all the stuff that they enjoyed about investing is still there. So that's kind of intentionally how Lofty is developed.
Okay. Now the governance of the property management, how does that happen? Because I know not now a lot of your properties that are coming online now, the owners are still owning I think the majority of it, or maybe not. Like I think there's a cap to how much I, as an individual guy, can come in and own of equity.
Yeah.
And then there's an amount that the owner, right, is currently either self-managing or they come to the equation with the property management in place. How does that work? How does that look?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it gets a little complicated, but it's roughly still the exact same method where, owners get to vote with their tokens. The only difference here is we now allow people to sell a portion of their ownership. So before, you used to have to sell the entire property or nothing, right? But it turns out flexibility is what a lot of sellers need and want in the real estate market. And so we have all these people come to us and say, hey, I love my property. I just want to sell like 20% because I want to pull cash out and like invest in another thing or do something else with my business or whatever is the case. But I don't want to sell all of it. Like, can you guys do that? We started getting a lot of those inquiries. And so we developed a new governance model where we call it the scaled governance model. And the difference here is that basically your voting rights are scaled relative to your ownership percentage. So it's not always one-to-one anymore. Okay. And I won't go into the algorithm because it's a little bit complicated. But the rough idea, to give you an example, is if you're selling 10% of your property and you own 100% of the property outright. Let's say you have no debt, right? And you sold 10%. You would still own 90% of the property. And in that scenario, your voting rights would actually only equal 54%. So you're scaled down. And then the other owners who only own, like one or two tokens, their voting rights are scaled up slightly. And so it still maintains this sort of fair democratic process where you, as the majority owner, still have a huge amount of say, because again, it takes 60% to form a supermajority to pass, and you alone make up 54%. So you are still like, hey, it's very fair. Like, you own the majority of the property, so you should get the majority of the decision. But you can't unilaterally decide what to do, which is incredibly fair to all the other owners, because you can't form a supermajority by yourself. So you still need to convince at least 6% of the other votes to vote alongside you for things to pass, right? And that's how that works in these scale governance programs. Now, for a lot of these newer properties, owners aren't just selling 10% because these properties have debt, right? And on our platform, we actually differentiate like a very hard line between debt and equity, right? So the debt portion represented by the mortgage is actually locked away in an escrow account. So those tokens exist, but they're not in circulation. And so all the seller can do is sell the actual equity portion that they own free and clear outside of the mortgage, right? And out of that portion, once they sell down a certain percentage, they're forced to maintain at least 10% ownership. What ends up happening is a lot of times this just goes back to a normal ownership. They're below the 15% cap. And so it's still back to one-to-one token voting, right? And so in a lot of cases, the scale governance program doesn't even kick in because the seller's actual equity is below the high threshold. And what ends up happening is, as they pay off their mortgage each month, they unlock a portion of the tokens equivalent to the equity that they paid off in the mortgage, and that they basically sort of buy it from the lender, if you will, and that gets sent back to them. So they're building up their equity over time, just as as you pay down a mortgage, you're building up your equity over time.
Hey, thanks for having me on. If anybody else wants to find out more about what we're doing, please come to froggycompanies.com. Check out our 3 different business areas. We also have the Froggy Fund 1 that's now open for up to $18 million. We're going to be investing that $18 million across a diverse number of assets, cash flowing and ground up. And I'm really excited about this fund and really confident that we can outperform most of the other people out there in terms of what we invest in and how we do our due diligence and the type of partners we put together. So it's great talking to you, and see you next time.